Hello and welcome to Radio EastMed's latest monthly installment of all the updates of the developments that happened in the Eastern Mediterranean throughout the month of June 2020. I am your host, Editor-in-Chief Ertan Karpazli. Without further ado, let's get cracking on our first story. Egypt has warned that it will send its military into Libya if necessary as a game-changing battle for the strategic coastal city of Sirte looms. Cairo has supported renegade commander Khalifa Haftar's Libyan National Army and the eastern-based government throughout the conflict in Libya, but until June gave no indication it was willing to get directly involved. Before Turkey sent troops to support the embattled UN-recognized Government of National Accord in Tripoli in late 2019, Haftar's forces appeared to be on the verge of fulfilling a promise to capture the Libyan capital and declare an all-out victory. But the Turkish intervention bolstered the depleted GNA forces, and since capturing the strategic Al-Watiya airbase southeast of Tripoli in May, the GNA has turned the tables on Haftar. Haftar, who is supported by Saudi Arabia, UAE and Russia, has since been on the back foot. His forces have all but retreated from northwestern Libya and must now defend Sirte against the resurgent GNA. Preventing the city from falling to the GNA is a matter of life or death for Haftar and the rival government in Tobruk. Should the GNA take control of Sirte, not only would it allow the GNA to regain control of Libya's oil exports, it would also serve as a springboard for its eastward charge towards Benghazi. The loss of Sirte would ultimately mean defeat for Haftar's LNA and the Tobruk-based House of Representatives. It would also give Turkey dibs on establishing a new military base in Libya and reassert its maritime dominance in the Eastern Mediterranean. Given that Turkey, under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, is a keen supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood movement, which has been suppressed in Egypt ever since 2013 when General-turned-President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi ousted his presidential predecessor, the late Mohamed Morsi, this potential outcome would be disastrous for Egypt. Egypt therefore has now no choice but to take the Libya conflict more seriously. It is, however, reluctant to get involved. Despite having one of the strongest militaries in the world, including a powerful navy, Egypt cannot risk getting into a direct conflict with Turkey, especially since it has more pressing security issues to deal with in the Sinai Peninsula. Egypt's capabilities may also be overstretched if its diplomatic spat with Ethiopia over the filling of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam spirals out of control into a full-on war. The mega dam built on the Blue Nile threatens to cut water flows to downstream states Sudan and Egypt to its north. This could put the livelihood of some 150 million people at risk, almost two-thirds of whom live along the Nile in Egypt. Egypt has warned that it will use its military against Ethiopia if necessary, and has pleaded for US mediation in solving the problem. If tensions with Ethiopia escalate, Egypt would struggle to fight two separate battles on its southern and western fronts. The Egyptian economy has also been severely hit by the coronavirus pandemic, and with Sisi's approval ratings already at a low, there are fears that public discontent could grow. However, Egypt has been offered a lifeline which could allow it to focus more on its problems with Turkey. Ethiopia has agreed to delay filling its dam to give more time to reach an agreement with its northern counterparts. Egypt has also secured a $5.2 billion bailout from the International Monetary Fund, in addition to $2.8 billion that was given as aid to alleviate some of its problems caused by the coronavirus pandemic. Yet despite receiving this help, its central bank reserves fell from $37 billion to $36 billion in May, indicating the country's economy is in serious trouble. The global gas glut, which has been worsened by the coronavirus pandemic, has also dashed hopes of a quick economic recovery, as investments in Egypt's energy sector have been put in doubt. With a booming population of over 100 million people, a large proportion of whom are young and unemployed, Egypt must consider expanding into new pastures or face implosion. An Egyptian expansion, however, must be carefully planned and implemented. One wrong move could result in disaster. Egypt therefore cannot afford to be reactionary. If it is to confront Turkey and Libya, it would need support. Many who oppose the Turkish presence in Libya are looking at Egypt to make the first move, as the Egyptian army is the only regional force that could possibly match Turkey's strength. Any military effort against Turkey in the region must include Egypt, otherwise it faces certain failure. However, until now, Egypt itself has had no need to confront Turkey. Although Turkey is violating the claimed exclusive economic zones of Cyprus and Greece, both countries Egypt cooperates with closely in the Mediterranean. Turkey has expressed no desire to infringe on Egypt's maritime territory. If anything, Ankara has told Cairo that it believes a maritime demarcation deal between Egypt and Cyprus is actually cheating Egypt out of a swathe of sea territory. But if Turkey's allies in Libya manage to charge towards Egypt's border, Cairo may have a reason to take preemptive actions on its western front. In such a scenario, Egypt would still be reluctant to go it alone. It would depend on financial support from Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But if Turkey plays its cards right with the US, these two American allies in the Arab Gulf may have to limit their support. Either way, Egypt cannot rely on Arab financial support alone. It would need the help of a nation with a common interest that is willing to put boots on the ground in eastern Libya. France, for example. France is equally distressed by Turkey's growing influence in North Africa and is desperate for a land corridor from the North African coast to the mineral-rich Sahel region. But France too is reluctant to confront its NATO ally, especially if that means appearing to side with Russian Wagner Group mercenaries that fight alongside Haftar's forces. Likewise, Greece wouldn't want to enter the fray as it fears direct conflict with Turkey without strong European resolve behind it. The most logical thing, therefore, would be for Egypt to preserve eastern Libya as a buffer between itself and Turkish-backed forces. To ensure this, Egypt needs to exhaust all diplomatic options to prevent the fall of Sirte to the GNA. Haftar's forces must not falter in the face of a Tripoli-led offensive. Any weakness in the wall, if exploited, could result in Egypt having a government with elements that are sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood on its borders. US support for this mission is key, and in order to secure that, Egypt has to give the US certain guarantees. This would mean addressing Washington's biggest concern in the region, Russian influence. Currently, Turkish troops in western Libya, as detrimental as their presence is to European nations, are the main frontline force preventing Russian mercenaries marching westwards from Sirte towards the Atlantic. The further from the Atlantic they are pushed back, the better it will be for American interests. To get American support, therefore, Egypt would have to present another way to eliminate the Russian presence. There is of course another factor at play. An economic downturn in Turkey is peddling rumours of an early election there. As the economic situation in Turkey worsens, President Erdogan's approval ratings will continue to decline. A snap election would offer no guarantees of an Erdogan victory, but it could offset a potential rebellion and buy the governing AK Party more time in power. Erdogan is certainly more likely to come out on top by declaring an election while the Turkish opposition is caught with its guard down than if he was to give them time to organize an effective campaign. Even then, an early election could result in a change of government in Turkey, replacing Erdogan's administration with one less sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood and less ambitious regarding overseas military endeavors. A changing government, however, is not likely to result in a Turkish withdrawal from Libya, but it would take the steam out of the GNA offensive and open the door to a normalization of ties between Turkey and Egypt. France has announced that it is temporarily pulling out of a NATO mission in the Mediterranean, apparently in protest at the military bloc's failure to support it in a recent dispute with Turkey. Early in June, France complains that a Turkish warship locked its radar on a French Navy vessel, indicating that a missile strike was imminent. Turkey denied the accusation, but France brought it up to NATO, which said it would investigate what happened. Officials have said that a secret report prepared by NATO about the incident turned out to be inconclusive, angering the French government even more and leaving Turkey to demand an apology. France and Turkey have been at odds with each other in the Mediterranean since Ankara struck a deal with the UN-recognized Libyan government in Tripoli in late 2019. The deal carved up a maritime territory claimed by Greece and saw Turkish troops sent to Tripoli to help the Libyan government defend the city from an offensive led by renegade commander Khalifa Haftar. In a show of solidarity with its EU partner Greece, France sent a warship to the region to intercept weapons being smuggled to Libya and reinforce the arms embargo on the country. In effect, this was cutting off arms shipments from Turkey to its allies in Libya, thus weakening the Turkish hand in Tripoli. Greece, never more needy for international support in dealing with Turkish naval intimidation in the area, welcomed the French vessel, as did Cyprus. The real issue for France, however, has been the gradual rise of Turkish soft power in North Africa, which was once France's colonial playground. The fall of Algeria's longtime leader Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who was deposed last year after 20 years in charge, has seen new competitors enter the former French colony. Concerned by the charge of Egyptian-backed Khalifa Haftar's forces towards its borders, Algeria has shown more of an inkling towards supporting the Turkish-backed Libyan government of national accord. Where Algeria has gone, former French colonies Morocco and Tunisia have followed, further strengthening Turkey's position in the Maghreb. These countries are doing their best to stay out of the conflict and style themselves as possible mediators. But the reality is that Turkey is proving to be an appealing alternative to French influence in the region. What's more is that this newly emerging power balance appears to have the backing of the US, which is more concerned about the Russian mercenaries found within Khalifa Haftar's ranks, possibly marching towards Africa's Atlantic coast. Meanwhile, France's main worry is that its traditional route from North Africa to the mineral-rich Sahel region is being cut off by a rival power. France needs to maintain access to the Sahara and has shown a willingness to stand on the same side as NATO's arch-enemy Russia to do so, and even with a pushist military commander who is accused of war crimes against an internationally recognized government. Yet France has been unable to take unilateral military action against its NATO ally Turkey. NATO cannot give in to French pressure to ostracize Turkey, as Turkey remains a strategic member of the bloc, with the second largest army after the US, and the only member seemingly willing to share a front line with the Russians. Doing so would certainly destabilize the bloc and even lead to greater Russian gains in the eastern Mediterranean. At the same time, local powers Greece and Egypt are unwilling to confront Turkey militarily unless absolutely necessary. Should France attempt to go it alone against Turkey, Turkey would certainly have the home advantage, while French troops would be exposed, vulnerable and far away from vital supply lines. In such a circumstance, France cannot even rely on its EU ally Italy for support, as the Italians are not keen to see French influence expand into Libya, a former Italian colony. Naturally, the Italians are not happy about any rival competitor entering its former backyard, especially since Libya lies immediately on the other side of the Mediterranean. However, Italy knows Russian influence will likely remain limited due to poor logistics between Russia and Libya, while Turkey, due to its diplomatic weakness, would be more likely to share power in the future. Italy itself does not have the strength to get involved directly, and even if it did, its intervention would not be welcomed by the Libyan people because of its bloody history in the North African state. Italy's best bet at getting a piece of the pie would be to get in sneakily under Turkey's wing. The two countries in June held joint naval exercises in the Mediterranean as a testament to this strategy. And while Italy continues to advocate for Libyan unity and UN-led diplomatic efforts to bring about a ceasefire, it is happy to take advantage of the situation by maintaining an ambiguous stance. In other words, Italy is stepping back and saying, if you want my support, you're going to have to spoil me. One benefit has been a new maritime demarcation deal it secured with Greece. At the same time, Italy has had the luxury to put an arms deal with Egypt into question by bringing up a 2016 murder of an Italian student in Cairo, perhaps in a bid to seek favors from Egypt in other areas. Nonetheless, Italy does not want to see France succeed in Libya, and while carrying out its damage control, has assessed its interests to be better off in the hands of the Turks than in the hands of the French. But France is determined to punish Turkey for interfering in Libya by exercising its position in the EU. President Emmanuel Macron has proposed a discussion about Turkey, suggesting the suspension of its EU membership bid and even possible economic sanctions. However, while Macron is likely to find sympathizers in the EU for his cause, the truth is that the real movers and shakers in the EU are also members of NATO, and are therefore more likely to give in to American pressure to back off. Macron himself has long been an advocate for a European army that would undermine NATO's position in Europe. This makes him a Thor in relations between NATO and the EU. It certainly does not make him very popular with the Trump administration, which is calling on European countries to contribute more to NATO. Regardless, the fact is that as things stand, there is no united European force that can confront Turkey, so Macron's options are limited to diplomatic efforts only. The best he can do is utter condemnations, urge parties to abide by the UN peace process, and lobby for sympathizers. Threats against Turkey's EU membership bid are not likely to deter Turkey from pursuing its national interests, and sanctions, if they pass, are likely to be no more than symbolic slaps on the wrist. A real attack on the Turkish economy could backfire, as there would be repercussions on European markets. Spain would feel the side effects of sanctions on Turkey the most, and would therefore throw in its veto. It is a harsh lesson to learn, but France needs to bite the bullet and take a more humble approach in dealing with Turkey. It should perhaps follow Germany's example of non-interference and diplomatic mediation. Indeed, it appears that the French episode in North Africa is over, and a new episode with Turkey at the forefront has begun. Like Italy, France needs to figure out where it belongs in this new status quo. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Greece's Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis broke a silence of 6 months in June to discuss low-level policy issues in a phone call. Their conversation may have just been limited to the coronavirus pandemic and tourism, but it was their first direct contact since January the 24th. In those 6 months, a lot has happened to sour the relationship between Turkey and Greece. Greece has accused Turkey of infringing on its claimed exclusive economic zone in the Mediterranean following Turkey's deal with the UN-recognized government of Libya at the end of 2019. The deal between Ankara and Tripoli marks out a sea border of maritime territories between Turkey and Libya. The problem for Athens is that the deal between Turkey and Libya overlaps with a previous deal between Greece and the Republic of Cyprus. Under the Turkish-Libyan deal, a huge swathe of sea territory that is claimed by Greece south of the Aegean is handed to Turkey. Greece has protested this in the international arena. But in the absence of a maritime demarcation deal between Greece and Turkey, we are left with two contradicting claims. Despite the absence of a Greek-Turkish agreement, Athens bases its claims on its interpretation of an updated version of the Law of the Sea, an international treaty to which Turkey is not a signatory. The treaty in question allows islands off the mainland to have their own maritime zones for hydrocarbon exploration. As the majority of small islands in the Aegean belong to Greece, Greece's claim restricts Turkey's exploration rights to its own immediate coastline, in effect blocking Turkey within the Bay of Iskenderun. Moreover, Greece, in its deal with Cyprus, has been able to connect its maritime zone with that of Cyprus thanks to the tiny island of Castellarizo, located just 2 miles south of Turkey's coastal Antalya province. This deal threatens to block Turkey's access to the open seas. In response, Turkey struck a deal with the Tripoli-based Libyan government to secure a maritime corridor. Just as Greece and Cyprus exercised a maximalist policy that ignored the concerns of Turkey, Turkey did the same to Greece in its deal with Libya. The resulting scenario led to Turkish warships and Greek warships coming head-to-head in the region. The Turkish-Libyan deal particularly enraged France, which has sent its own warship to the region to boost its European partner Greece. This escalation of tensions almost came to blows in June when a Greek Navy helicopter, operating as part of the EU's Irene operation in the Mediterranean, was forced to back off from a cargo ship en route to Libya following warnings from a nearby Turkish frigate. What took place that day was actually a battle of wits. Turkey proved to Greece the lengths that it is willing to go to in order to protect its interests in Libya. Greece's tough stance towards Turkey turned out to be a bluff, and without the confidence of a united European front against Turkey, the Greeks were left with no choice but to back down from the incident. Very logically, a reluctant but gradual de-escalation of tensions has followed. Greek Foreign Minister Nikos Dendias invited Turkey to join its Eastern Mediterranean Pact with Cyprus and Israel. The pact envisions the export of natural gas to Europe via an undersea pipeline. Of course, given that Turkey does not recognize the Republic of Cyprus, Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu in his response could not accept the offer. Instead, Çavuşoğlu suggested making way for Turkey by taking Cyprus out of the equation. Turkey has denied the legitimacy of the Republic of Cyprus since a Greek-inspired coup on the island in 1974. Turkey only recognizes the self-declared Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, a state set up by the island's Turkish Cypriots in the Turkish-controlled north. Therefore, Turkey has a tendency to reject any international agreement with the predominantly Greek Cypriot Republic based in the south, arguing that deals violate the rights of its Turkish Cypriot allies. Likewise, Turkey denies any claims of the Republic of Cyprus to a maritime territory, and just as Ankara asserts Turkish claims to what is internationally recognized as belonging to Cyprus, it also encourages other Eastern Mediterranean countries to do the same. That is why Çavuşoğlu told Israel that its deal with Cyprus had ceded Israeli maritime territory to the Greek Cypriots. Turkey has tried this tactic before to win over its neighbors, namely Egypt. By offering a greater share of the Eastern Mediterranean pie to each nation, Turkey is trying to make a partnership with itself seem more lucrative than a partnership with Cyprus. And while it is true that Israel and Egypt particularly could expand their maritime claims into Cypriot waters by siding with Turkey, both nations have assessed that there is more to lose in betraying Cyprus than there is in ceding maritime territory. But Turkey has also made it clear that until its interests in the region are secured, it is willing to use its military to consistently disrupt and sabotage attempts to bring the EastMed pipeline to fruition. Turkey is ready for a military confrontation, but its opponents in the region are not. Israel and Egypt are not in desperate need for the pipeline, especially as the world is in the middle of a gas glut. Doubts over whether the pipeline will be economically or even scientifically viable still linger. both nations have more pressing issues that they need to tend to. It is also clear that Greece and Cyprus do not have the power to take on Turkey militarily without international support, and neither NATO nor the EU has shown willingness to jump into the fray on their behalf. Even Greek Cypriot leader Nikos Anastasiades had enough sense to recently remark that a military solution to the Cyprus problem would end Greek Cypriots on the island, a rebuttal of his defence minister who called on the EU to form a navy to confront Turkey. Indeed, diplomacy is the only weapon Greece and the Greek Cypriots have against Turkey, but if they really want to go anywhere with Turkey, they're going to have to give credence to its demands and acknowledge it as a main player in the region, not one to be ignored. Europe has shown to lack the resolve to confront Turkey, leaving the Greeks with no choice but to wave the white flag. If Greece wants peace and security on its eastern front, it is going to have to give concessions on its maximalist policy in the Aegean. Then again, Greece's European partners may wish to prolong the Turkish threat on the continent's southeastern flank to create the illusion of a conflict. This would influence EU policymakers to take strict measures against Turkey, such as sanctions, and thus prevent Turkish soft power from seeping into the Balkans. The ball now is in Greece's court, and Athens must decide what it wants: peace with the Turks at the expense of Europe, or regional instability with its most powerful neighbour without any security guarantees from its Western allies. Israel has failed to meet its own July 1st deadline to start annexing parts of the occupied West Bank and Jordan Valley. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, leader of the self-styled Jewish state, had promised to deliver on the annexation plan as part of his re-election campaign earlier this year. Having failed to reach a majority in the Israeli parliament, his right-wing Likud party looks set to be sidelined by the leftist blue and white bloc, led by his election rival Benny Gantz. Had Gantz accepted a coalition with Netanyahu's arch-enemy, ultra-nationalist secularist Avigdor Lieberman, both Netanyahu and his annexation plan would have been put to bed. However, Gantz instead accepted to become Netanyahu's sidekick in a grand coalition which would see his blue and white bloc take control of Israel's judiciary and defense ministry, as well as implement a rotational leadership. Suddenly Netanyahu, who currently faces charges for corruption, unexpectedly found himself in a position to follow up on his promises. But it hasn't been that simple for Netanyahu. He may have got a nod and a wink from the Trump administration in the US, but the fact is that even many Israelis are against the plan, as they fear it might trigger a Palestinian uprising. Palestinian militant group Hamas, which controls the Gaza Strip, has said annexation would be received as a declaration of war. Neighbouring state Jordan has also expressed alarm at the plan. In fact, the Arab world in general stands against it, and a number of Arab countries have warned that any attempt to annex Palestinian land would jeopardize any possible normalization of Arab-Israeli relations. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, has also urged Israel to abandon this plan, warning the move would torpedo any future peace efforts. Meanwhile, in the European Union, over 1,000 MEPs have signed a letter against it. EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell has also said annexation may have significant consequences for the close relationship between Israel and the EU. Despite missing its own deadline, Israel still insists it will proceed with the annexation in July, but it seems to be waiting to get greater support from its main backer, the US, first of all, as well as a wider approval from Europe. 9 EU countries actually recognize Palestine as a state, so even those that don't recognize Palestine largely oppose annexation for the sake of not complicating relations with those that do. Funnily enough, however, some EU states that recognize Palestine are actually among Israel's closest allies in the bloc, such as Hungary, Czech Republic, Poland and Slovakia, or the Visegrad Group. These countries recognized Palestine in 1988 when they were still under communist rule. But today, under far-right leadership, they have aligned themselves with Israel. Yet when it comes to the issue of annexation, Israel has failed to make inroads with more liberal and influential Western European countries. This is where Cyprus comes in. The Republic of Cyprus enjoys good relations with Israel. Cyprus does recognize Palestine, but also works closely with Israel in the Eastern Mediterranean. Israel has been one of Cyprus's most trusted allies when it comes to dealing with Turkey. In return, Cyprus has long served as a sympathizer to Israeli interests within the EU. Cyprus, also known to be a more moderate country that stays away from political extremes, unlike its Eastern European counterparts, also has strong ties with Western European nations such as France, Germany, and Italy. Israel therefore seeks to use Cyprus as a moderating voice in discourse with European countries, as Israel's Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi stated to his Cypriot counterpart Nikos Christodoulides during the latter's visit to Israel in June. Cyprus owes Israel this favor for Israel's support and cooperation on joint security and energy projects in the region, as well as diplomatic efforts to keep Turkey out of Cypriot affairs. As small as Cyprus is, thanks to its strategic geographical location on Europe's front line with the Middle East, it carries significant political leverage. It is Europe's gateway to the Middle East, but Israel may be overestimating Cyprus's ability to influence other EU countries. First of all, there is strong opposition to the Israeli annexation within Cyprus, predominantly coming from the Greek Cypriot leftist Akel party. Secondly, Cypriot support for the plan to annex the occupied West Bank would be hypocritical on its behalf, considering that the northern part of Cyprus is under what Greek Cypriots call a Turkish occupation. Turkey opposes the Israeli plan, so Cyprus's support for Israel in this matter could later be used as an excuse by Turkey to bring up its own annexation agenda in northern Cyprus. Neither Cyprus nor its closest ally Greece is prepared to go down that route with Turkey anytime soon, especially with the lack of European resolve to engage Turkey militarily. Thirdly, as much as Cyprus is a key member of the EU, we must not forget that the island is a former British colony and still hosts two sovereign British bases. Britain is no longer in the EU and would therefore want to consolidate its soft power in Cyprus, where EU influence tends to rival its own. Britain wishes to maintain good ties with Turkey and Arab nations in the Middle East, and does not want to encourage any scenario that would result in a regional conflict and will threaten its national interests. Furthermore, Cyprus is not a member of NATO and therefore does not share that extra level of cooperation with EU countries that are. Nonetheless, Cyprus seems unlikely to fulfill Israel's request. It probably couldn't even if it wanted to. Of course, Israel knows that already. The fact that Israel has to rely on Cyprus to win the EU's favor in itself is an act of hopeless desperation. It has become clear to Israel that US support is not enough to be able to do what it wants, and perhaps it has already reached the full extent of its power. The promise of annexation worked wonders in helping Netanyahu come first in the elections, albeit finishing short of a majority. This tactic helped him retain the right-wing vote in Israel, just as support for annexation will help US President Donald Trump gain the favor of the Jewish lobby in America in upcoming elections there. But perhaps even Netanyahu himself didn't half expect to be put on the spot regarding this promise. When offering support for annexation as a concession in coalition talks, Netanyahu's rival Benny Gantz most likely did so knowing that the Israeli Prime Minister would not be able to fulfill it. Yet, having come this far, Israeli officials are indicating that the plan is still on. It would be embarrassing for Israel to back out now. But with virtually no international support, and even US backing still in question, Israel risks taking one step too far and triggering a backlash that will put its very existence under threat. The demise of Iran's grip on Syria and Lebanon has been long coming. Gone are the days of the nuclear deal Iranian President Hassan Rouhani struck with the former Obama administration. Back then, there was some hope of a normalization in the Middle East and some kind of Israeli coexistence with Iran. But Israel was never on board with this dream, and Donald Trump made it very clear whose side he was on as soon as he became US President in 2016. Trump kept his word in cancelling the deal, in effect giving Iran no choice but to abandon the path of moderation and continue its forced entry to the Mediterranean via its militant and political proxies. Under the late General Qasem Soleimani, the Quds Force, which is responsible for the overseas operations of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, boasted of many successes in the Syrian civil conflict. Working in tandem with the Lebanon-based Hezbollah militant group and the paramilitary Shabiha to bolster regime leader Bashar al-Assad, the force helped create an all-important corridor linking Iran-backed Shia proxies in Iraq with the Levant region. This naturally has upset Israel, Iran's sworn enemy, which has been targeting Iranian military commanders in Syria with airstrikes. The impact of these airstrikes have been minimal, but when a US drone took out Qasem Soleimani in Iraq in January, Iran's operations in Syria suffered a major blow. Hezbollah, meanwhile, has been distracted by problems back home in Lebanon. The Lebanese pound has tumbled to 7,500 to the US dollar amid a major economic crisis that has seen prices for meat and poultry triple in recent days. People in Lebanon are growing ever more frustrated, with reports that some are resorting to selling their furniture in order to have money to eat. Already 2 men have been driven to suicide by extreme hunger. And as protests continue to disrupt public order throughout Lebanon, the people are blaming the country's sectarian political elite for creating a failed state. At the center of these allegations is Hezbollah, a powerful political party which claims to represent Lebanon's Shia community. Critics accuse Hezbollah of not being sincere in talks with the International Monetary Fund to secure a vital bailout. To secure a loan, Lebanon will be expected to carry out important political reforms that would weaken Hezbollah. Hezbollah is quite content with the current system, as it guarantees them a voice within the national leadership. Under the current system, Hezbollah also controls Lebanon's border with Syria and is responsible for cross-border smuggling that has lost Lebanon billions in tax revenues. Among the items being smuggled to Syria include state-subsidized goods that fetch a better price across the border, leaving the Lebanese people short of vital supplies. The militant group, come political party, will not give up these privileges easily, and without Hezbollah approval, the Lebanese government will not have the ability to fulfill the IMF's conditions. Already 2 senior Lebanese officials involved in the negotiations with the IMF have resigned due to what they said was a lack of real resolve to make reforms. Instead, Hezbollah seems to be holding out for investments from China, but in doing so is putting the entire state of Lebanon at risk of implosion. One may ask why Hezbollah would burn its own breadbasket by sabotaging talks with the IMF. It could be that the group believes it stands to gain more in the event of a total collapse of the state. Any retreat from its position would be a huge step back not only for itself but also its main backer Iran. Hezbollah knows that Iran has no intention of surrendering the Levant without a fight, because to lose its corridor of influence to the Mediterranean would mean a permanent defeat that would be almost impossible to recover from. Should a civil conflict break out in Lebanon, Iran would be sure to double down its support for Hezbollah, the same way it backed the Assad regime in Syria. This is because, in reality, Iran is not interested in strong states in the region as much as it is interested in maintaining strong proxies. But another problem brewing for Iran is Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Just like in Lebanon, Syria has also been suffering from an economic downturn, which has been made worse by the implementation of the US Caesar Act sanctions that aim to target the Syrian regime and its affiliates. So bad has been the depreciation of the Syrian pound that Turkish-controlled areas in northern Syria have now switched to trading in the Turkish lira. Anti-Assad protests mimicking those before the civil war broke out in 2011 have emerged in the Druze majority province of Soweida. This shows that even ethnic and religious minorities in Syria that have typically seen their interests more aligned with the Alawite-led regime are now turning against Assad. To offset the crisis, Assad replaced his Prime Minister Imad Khamis with his Water Minister Hussein Arnous, but this has come across as a poor attempt to deflect blame. Yet, ironically, just as Assad appeared to be at his weakest, the US envoy to Syria, James Jeffrey, suddenly said that the US is no longer demanding to Assad to step down. It is only asking him to change his behavior. This can be interpreted as an offer to stay in power with US support in exchange for cutting off ties with Iran. Even Russia, who Assad ultimately owes his survival to, has very subtly been hinting that it does have a more compliant alternative on standby to replace him if he doesn't prioritize Russian interests over Iran. The fact is, Russia's main interest in supporting Assad throughout the war has been because his regime has been the safest bet for Syria's Orthodox Christian community, which Moscow seeks to bolster. And while Russia and Iran have shared mutual interest in supporting Assad throughout much of the war, those interests are now starting to diverge, and it is clear that Russia will not sacrifice its relationship with Turkey and Israel for Iran's sake. Assad now has a clear incentive to disown Iran and its proxies. The only other option for him is to continue on his current trajectory and face demise. With this in mind, Iran can no longer trust Assad to serve its cause. While Tehran will continue to pressure Assad to act in its interests, it cannot rely on him alone. The reported visit of Iran's new Quds Force commander to Al-Bul Kamal on the Syrian-Iraqi border recently demonstrates that Tehran is by no means intending to pull out of the Levant, contrary to some reports. For Iran, it is an all-or-nothing scenario, and it cannot afford to allow its influence to be rolled back to its own borders. The tighter the noose on its neck, the more it will kick. Iran's execution will not be quick, and it certainly will not be clean. And that's all we have regarding the latest developments in the Eastern Mediterranean for the month of June 2020. Thank you for listening. I have been your host, Radio EastMed's Editor-in-Chief Ertan Karpazli. Once again, thank you for listening, and we hope that you tune in next month for even more developments from the region. Thank you.